Hi everyone, in this tutorial I wanted to show you how to make these sparks using geometry node system. First we will create the geometry node system and then some materials, and to create this nice color transition we will be using attributes from geometry nodes inside our materials. So let's jump into new blend file and start making the sparks. Okay, so let's start by deleting everything except our default cube, so I select it and press Ctrl I and X delete. Now let's jump into Geometry Nodes tab and create a new system. Let's call it Sparks. So let's start by creating our emitter point, which means that the point from our sparks will be starting. I will use for this the UV sphere. So let's search for mesh primitives UV sphere and plug it here. This is 1 meter in radius, so it's a little too big. So I will use radius of 5 centimeters. Here we go. I will hide tools panel by pressing T key. And also I will hide the gizmos to make a little bit more space over here. Okay. By pressing Shift B, we can focus on our sphere a little bit more. Okay, now I will distribute some points over here, so let's drag and search for distribute points on faces. So this point is a little too big because I can't clearly see what I'm doing here. So let's change the radius of this point by adding a node called set point radius. And let's set it to something smaller, maybe 1, 0. Okay. That's good for now. So I want a little bit more of these points, maybe something like this. Okay, and this is it for now. Let's frame it and call it base points. And now I would like to create these curves to our sparks. So we need to scatter some curves on this point. So let's first create base curve. So I will create the base curve inside our geometry nodes network, but if you want you can just create the curve here with the shape that you want. We can pin it, and thanks to that, no matter what object I have selected, it's still the same network here. And now we can just drag our curve here and we can use it here. But I will create my curve inside, so let's search for node curves primitives Bezier segment. Let's preview it. And as you can see, it's the same shape as our primitive curve Bezier. And to adjust it, let's change the start and end position and our handle position. So let's set everything to 0. Let's drag all over it and set 0. So to better see what we are doing, let's go to front view. We can press numpad 1 for it, or if we unhide our gizmos, you can also select it here. Okay, so let's start adjusting the shape of our Bezier by changing the end position. And now let's adjust the handle position. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that result, but you can adjust it however you want. Let's now scatter this on our base point. So to do this we will use instance on point node. So let's search for instance on point. And as instance let's plug our Bezier. As you can see, everything is perfectly aligned, and we'll want a little bit of randomness here. So let's make a little bit more space here, and to random rotate it, we'll just use the random node. If you search for random value node, it's set by default to float, but if we drag from our rotation input and then search for random, it's already set to vector. So it's a little bit more convenient to just drag from the output to have correct value type. Okay, I will set everything for 0 for now. And first let's adjust the minimum. As you can see, we have nice spread. And let's just do the same to maximum. And as you can see, we have nice random rotation. It's already started looking like sparkles. Okay, the next problem that I don't like, let's go to the front view. As you can see, they all have basically the same length, and I want to randomize it a little bit. And to do this, we need to edit each instance individually. So we need to realize our instances, because now we can only rotate, scale, and transform each instance, but we can't edit individually the geometry of each instance. So let's use the realize instance node. Let's search for it. And now we are able to edit each instance individually because they are no longer an instances. So to change the length of each curve individually, we can use the trim curve node. So let's search for it. It will be under curve, operations, trim curve. And what this node is doing, it's basically just trim curves. We can trim from the end or from the start. As you can see, we want to trim from end. But now the trim is uniform and we want a randomness. So to add a little bit more randomness, let's just use again the random value node. So let's drag and search for random value. As you can see, the default is now set to float. If we set everything to 0, everything is trimmed. If you set to 1, nothing is trimmed. So let's adjust the minimum value a little bit. And I think this is a really nice effect. Okay, let's frame it by pressing Ctrl J and call it maybe scatter curves. Okay, now I would like to add these little sparks at the end of our curves. So let's make a little bit more space here. And what we need to do first is to select the endpoints of our curves and then scatter on them our new tiny sparkles. So what we need to do is to first select the endpoints of our curves and then create on them our tiny sparkles. So let's first select them. I will start by adding the instance on point node to better see what we are doing. So let's search for instance on point, and we will be creating our tiny sparkles based on curve line. So I will add it now. Let's search for curve primitives curve line and use that as instances. And as you can see, now we have instances of the end and on the beginning of our curves. And what we actually wanted is to create these instances at the end of our input points. So we can do it actually pretty easily by using a node that is called endpoint selection. Let's search for it and plug it to our selection. As you can see, nothing has changed, and that's because the start size and end size are set to 1. If we set both to 0, nothing is selected. If we set end to 1, the first point of the curve is selected. And if you set the end point of curve is selected. Our curve is actually now only 2 points, but if we use the resample node to create much more points, now as you can see, we can select more points. But we don't need this resample, so I press Ctrl X to delete it and save our connection. So let's set our endpoint to end size 1 and start size to 0. And now we have our instances only on the end, which is exactly what you wanted. Let's adjust the size of curve line. Maybe something about this size. And now we need to make from this our tiny sparks. So what I want to do is to duplicate a few times each curve and rotate it randomly. This will give us the spark look what we wanted. Then we can maybe trim it a random amount like before. Okay, so to duplicate this curve, we can use the node that is just called duplicate elements. Let's plug it. As you can see, everything has disappeared because by default this duplicate element is set on points and what we actually want to duplicate is instances. And that is because, as you can see, instance on points create instances, no, not points. So we need to duplicate instances. Now we can set an amount, but what I actually want is to create random amount. So let's drag and search for random. And as you can see, it's set on integer. And I want something maybe from 7 to 17. As you can see, we can't really see the difference, but now I will use the rotate instances node. We can search it under instances, rotate instances. And let's use a random value here too. And now we can see that we have multiple lines thanks to duplicate element. If we increase it, as you can see, we have much more lines. But I think the 17 is pretty good. Let's randomize this value a little bit more. And now, as you can see, we have nice sparkles. And we can do the thing that we did before, which is the trim curve. Let's duplicate these 3 nodes by selecting them and pressing Shift D. And to get them out from the frame, we can press Alt and P. Let's plug it here. And we can play a little bit with the random value to create more interesting results. Okay, so let's frame it by selecting it and pressing Ctrl J and rename it to Tiny Sparks. Let's join the tiny sparks with the big one by searching for Join Geometry node. And this is our current results. I think I don't want these tiny sparks on every single main sparks. So I will modify the selection of our instance on points. Instead to create on every endpoint of this curve, I would like to add a little bit more randomness. So if I drag and search for node end, now to create the instance on point, both of the conditions must be true. So if I set it to true, as you can see, we have our sparks, and if it is false, we don't have anything. So what I can do now is search for random. Now this type is Boolean. And now, as you can see, we can change the probability to change the amount of sparks. I think maybe a little bit more. Yeah, this looks pretty good. So let's think about the animation a little bit, because when I play the animation now, as you can see, nothing is animated. And to create the base animation, I just animate the seed value, because as you can see, with different seed at the beginning, we have completely different results each time. So to animate this, I will use just the node that is called scene time, and let's plug frame into the seed. Now when I play animation, we have a really high speed effect. And to make it the transitions a little bit slower, we can divide frames by 2 and round it. And what we actually do now, if I am on frame, for example, 34, we divide it by 2 and we have 17. As you can see, we have 17. And then it rounded to 17, which means the seed is 17. But on frame 33, the divide is 16.5, but the round is still 17. So we have the same seed number both in frame 34 and 33. So we have half of the transitions in our animation. So when I play it now, as you can see, the speed is slower. You can slow it down even more by increasing this value. But I think the 2 works pretty well for me. Let's drag it over our frame to keep it clean. So now that we have it animated, let's convert the curve into geometry to actually being able to render it. So I would like to create both tiny sparks and main sparks separately, because I want the different radius. So let's use the node curve to mesh. Let's duplicate it. And to actually convert it, we need a profile curve. And let's use a simple curve circle for that. So let's search for curve primitives circle. Let's plug it here. And let's adjust the radius to something small. Maybe 0.0006 looks nice. And let's decrease the resolution because it's too high. I mean, you can't see this amount of points from this distance, for example. So let's change it to 8 maybe. Let's duplicate it. And let's plug it into second profile curve. And I would like actually this tiny spark be a little bit thinner. So let's change the 6 to 2. Okay. We can adjust the radiuses later when we will have our materials. Okay. And the last thing that I would like to do is to create the attribute that I will later use in materials for our long sparks. I would like to just create a parameter from 0 to 1 at the end to create a nice gradient in color. So to store the attributes, we will use just store named attribute node. I will plug it before our curve to mesh. And let's name it factor. And the attribute that will give us what we want, it's called spline parameter. To preview attributes, we can use Ctrl-Shift shortcut. And we also need geometry. So I will plug it again here. And as you can see, we have nice gradient from black color here to white color here. And we can just plug the factor into value, and now we will be able to use it in our materials. Okay, let's frame it to keep it clean and name it curve to mesh. And again here, curve to mesh. Okay, so this is basically it for geometry node setup. The last things that we actually need to do is to set materials. So let's create 2 materials and call the first one sparks main and sparks tiny. To set materials in geometry nodes, we can just use the set material node. And let's duplicate it, get out from the frame, and plug it here. Now we need to select our materials. And now we are good to go. So let's jump into shading. I will turn on the scene light and scene word. And let's focus on our sparks. And actually I would like to create the world a little bit darker. So let's first jump to world settings and make it black. Let's back to object. And first I would like to edit our sparks main. So let's delete our principled BSDF and let's add emission node. Now I would like to create this gradient both in color and in emission strength. So we need to use the attribute node to get our attribute from geometry nodes, and we will call it factor. And now when I preview it, as you can see, we have our gradient. So to have a better control, I will use the color ramp node, and let's duplicate it with connection by pressing Ctrl+Shift+D. And I will use this ramp as color and this ramp as strength. Okay, let's first talk about strength. So I would like it to be brighter here and less bright here. So we need to invert it. And let's increase the minimum value a little bit. And we need to increase the value above the 1, maybe 15. Okay, I would like to use cycles for it, so let's change the render engine to cycles. And I adjust some settings like GPU and denoise option. And what I actually do before materials, let's go to compositing, select use node, and let's the glare, add glare and set it to fog glow. Let's back into shading, and to see what we actually do in compositing, we create a glare. We must set the viewport shading to always. And now we have our nice glare. And as you can see, because we have stronger emission here, we have glare only here. So we can increase it even more. And maybe add another control, set it to maybe 6. And now we have control the glare distance basically. Okay, so I think it's pretty good for now. So let's focus on color. I would like the beginning to be white, so let's invert it. And as you can see, now the blur is too strong, so let's decrease the strength maybe a little bit to 12 and this to 5. Okay, that's good for now. Now let's focus on color. I will change the black to orange. And let's drag it more over here. And now we have nice transition from white to orange. Okay, so this is basically it for the first material. And now let's jump into second. And what we will do here is to just use simple emission, and let's change a color. Maybe increase strength a little bit. And what actually I wanted now is to maybe randomize the color of each spark. So we can do it by creating another attribute in our geometry nodes network. So let's jump back to the moment of creation of our elements. And what we can to store as attribute is to index before our duplication. Because if I store the duplicate index right here, each of the single line will have another value. And I would like to create the random value for a group of sparks. For example, this should be one value and this should be a second value. Not we have 7 individual values for it. Okay, so we need to store our attribute here. So let's use the attribute store name attribute and call it maybe random. And we actually need 2 more nodes. First will be the ID node. And this node will output unique number, unique index for each instances. So let's also change our store name attribute from point to instance, because these are instances. And this value, if I plug it into viewer and change auto to instances, as you can see, we have some really big numbers here. And we actually want the number from 0 to 1. So let's drag and search for random node. And we need the seed option. And now we have the random value from 0 to 1. And let's plug it to our value. And thanks to it, if I go to shading again, we can use these attributes here in attribute node. Let's search for random. If I plug it now As you can see, we have different shades of gray. So like before, let's use color ramp. Use this in color. And now we can add some more colors. And let's select different shades of yellow, orange, and red. Maybe even one white. Maybe a little bit more yellow. Okay, now we can play with this color a little bit to create the results that we like. And this is basically it. If I play animation now, as you can see, we have our dynamic animation. Of course, this is cycles, so it's not very smooth. We need to render it properly. But this is basically it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something new. And if you have any idea for future Blender tutorials, you can write them in the comments. So thanks again and bye.